By July 1945, the Japanese had deployed an army at each of the three probable battlefronts: the 51st Army at Kashima-Nada, the 52nd Army at Kujukuri-Hama, and the 53rd Army at Sagami Bay, plate numbers 125. The 36th Army, consisting of 6 line combat infantry divisions and 2 armoured divisions, was scheduled to move into Kujukuri-Hama and be in position, fully equipped, by January 1946. Regardless of where the main force of the anticipated invasion might actually strike, the Japanese had determined to repel first any American troops coming ashore at Kujukuri-Hama. Accordingly, Honshu defense plans directed that the bulk of Japan's fighting forces be massed at this point. Only after the action at Kujukuri-Hama was completed would the Japanese offensive move to other battlefronts. The Tokyo Bay Group and the Yokosuka Naval District Group were responsible for holding the Boso Peninsula and the Miura Peninsula to prevent Allied penetration of Tokyo Bay. The Tokyo Defense Army had been formed late in June 1945 to bolster the weak defenses of the capital. This force, consisting of 3 infantry brigades and 2 independent engineer battalions, was to be reinforced immediately after the battle was joined. 2 or 3 divisions and several tank and artillery units were to move in from other parts of Honshu to help secure the strategic central area of Tokyo and delay its capture as long as possible. It was also planned to construct a labyrinth of underground fortifications, manned and supplied to resist for more than a year. Whether or not these desperate but extensive defense measures would have made an invasion prohibitively expensive in American lives is a matter for speculation. It is reasonable to assume, however, that Operation Downfall could have been successfully concluded only after a hard and bitter struggle, with no quarter asked or given. It was fortunate for both sides that Japan realized the wisdom of surrender and that the Allied plan eventually executed was not downfall but blacklist, a peaceful occupation without gunfire, without further destruction, and without bloodshed. As the enemy fleet found neither respite nor refuge, the United States forces continued pressure on Japan. By the end of June 1945, American carriers navigated freely off the shores of Honshu and sent their bombing planes to hammer the great anchorages at Kure and Yokosuka. The time was ripe to hurl the whole might of the Allies against the defences of Kyushu as the first step in Operation Downfall. In American hands, Kyushu could accommodate 40 groups of the Far East Air Forces and provide unlimited opportunities for the use of air power against the military heart of Japan. In preparation for the main operation, Coronet, planes from Kyushu, could bomb every important target in Honshu, Korea, eastern Manchuria, and northern China. An additional 40 air groups based in the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa would magnify the potential force of destruction. The planes of these 80 air groups could drop 100,000 tons of bombs in September 1945 and 70,000 tons in January 1946. It was estimated that in March 1946, the projected date of the Honshu invasion, at least 220,000 tons of explosives could be released over the enemy's 4 main islands. In a single month, therefore, the industrial targets of Japan could be severely impacted. The U.S. Pacific Fleet had approximately 1/10 the area in which the Germans progressively cleared the ocean of Japanese targets. The fleet would be saturated by warships in successive battles that stretched almost 1/4 of the total bomb tonnage dropped from the waters of Midway to the East China Sea. This had bottled the decimated remnants of the Imperial Navy within their base ports. With the approach of summer, the general air and naval offensive against Japan intensified to pave the way for the planned invasion of Kyushu. From the middle of May, when fighters based on the island of Iishima first attacked targets in southern Japan, the scale of coordinated air raids by the 5th and 7th Air Forces rose steadily, reaching a peak previously unknown in the Pacific War. On Okinawa, all organized Japanese resistance ended by June 21st, and within 2 weeks, fighters and bombers of the 5th and 7th Air Forces began their powerful assaults against Kyushu, neutralizing enemy air strength, severing lines of communication, and isolating the island from the rest of Japan. Japanese targets in China also received their share of Allied attacks. Shanghai experienced its first large-scale aerial bombardment on July 17, 18, when the 7th Air Force sent more than 200 Liberators, Mitchells, Invaders and Thunderbolts from Okinawa over the great enemy-held industrial center in a 2-day demonstration of air power. While the 7th Air Force maintained its raids against Shanghai, the 5th and 13th Air Forces struck from bases in the Philippines to hit Formosa, Amoy, Swatow, Canton, and Hong Kong. The long-range bombers from the Marianas maintained a continuous shuttle over Japan itself, reducing its great industrial cities to ashes and rubble. In July, carrier planes from Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet contributed to the ceaseless strikes against the Japanese capital and its surrounding airfields. After supporting the Okinawa operation, the fast carriers of Vice ADM, John S. McCain's Task Force 38 departed from Leyte Gulf on July 1st and proceeded northward toward Japan. Arriving within striking range of Tokyo on July 10th, the Armada launched fighter and bomber sweeps against military installations in the metropolitan area, blasting targets with bombs and rockets. More than 1,000 carrier-based planes were employed as the relentless assault continued virtually unopposed throughout the day. It was the greatest massing of U.S. naval air power against the Japanese since the beginning of the Pacific War. Simultaneously with the carrier assaults, between 500 and 600 Marianas-based B-29S made their deepest penetration of Japan to that time, in destructive raids against the war factories of the enemy's home islands. In a direct challenge to Japan's remaining air and naval strength, the Third Fleet on July 14th approached within a few thousand yards of the enemy mainland off the steel plant city of Kamaishi, and, in the first direct naval bombardment of the homeland, fired thundering salvos into shore targets. Then, steaming 250 miles to the north, the mighty dreadnoughts and carriers struck installations in northern Honshu and southern Hokkaido on July 14th, 15. Moving southward again, the Third Fleet was augmented by a carrier task force of the British Pacific Fleet, and on July 17th carried out the first joint American-British bombardment of Japan. More than 2,000 tons of shells were fired into the coastal area at Hitachi, northeast of Tokyo. The next day, over 1,500 United States and British carrier planes climaxed the shore attacks with the greatest carrier strike in history against the Tokyo area. Following 8 days of continuous assault on enemy airfields, shipping and industrial targets, the Third Fleet, together with its accompanying British fleet units, turned its attention to eliminating whatever was left of the Japanese Navy. A heavy attack was launched on July 18th, when hundreds of carrier planes concentrated on the enemy warships, including the battleship Nagato, which were anchored at Yokosuka Naval Base. At the same time, a light detached force of the Third Fleet bombarded military installations at Nojimasaki during the night of July 18th, 19. 5 days later, on July 24th and 25, extensive air raids were launched against Kure and the Inland Sea area by the combined American-British naval force. This sixth carrier strike against the Japanese homeland since July 10th was followed by another raid on July 28th. 7th Air Force Liberators from bases on Okinawa joined the attack on Japan's remaining naval units in Empire waters by blasting the anchored warships at Kure. On July 30th, the Tokyo area was again pounded by aircraft from the fast carriers, while battleships poured more than 1,000 tons of shells into the key port, rail center, and industrial city of Hamamatsu on the east coast of central Honshu. Bad weather delayed the naval onslaught for the first few days of August, but on the 9th and 10th, northern Honshu was again subjected to air and sea attacks. The final heavy blow was delivered against Tokyo on August 13th, with carrier planes raking airfields and other military installations as primary targets. The suspension of hostilities early on the morning of the 15th found some carrier planes already airborne for an attack on Tokyo, but only one wave hit the objective area. A second wave was recalled before reaching its targets. Resistance by the Japanese to this stinging nine-tailed lash of Allied naval and air power was scattered and ineffective, The enemy sought to conserve his few remaining planes and ships for the expected invasion. In Asia, meanwhile, several Japanese ground divisions were being steadily deployed to defend the important industrial regions of northern China after the Soviet Union announced its intention not to renew its existing neutrality treaty with Japan on April 5th. Against the background of final military preparations for the invasion of Japan, international negotiations were underway, which were ultimately to make the projected operations Olympic and Coronet unnecessary. On July 17, 1945, the President of the United States, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and the Premier of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics met in a series of conferences at Potsdam, Germany, and discussed, among other things, the acceleration of the campaign against Japan. One result of this tripartite conference was that the Soviet Union finally agreed to enter the Pacific War. Another equally outstanding product of the Potsdam conferences was the Potsdam Declaration. President Truman and Prime Minister Attlee, with the concurrence of the President of the National Government of China, issued a final ultimatum to the Japanese government that gave Japan the choice of surrender or destruction. Set forth in powerful words of warning, the Potsdam Declaration read in part, "The prodigious land, sea and air forces of the United States, the British Empire and of China, many times reinforced by their armies and air fleets from the West, are poised to strike the final blows upon Japan. This military power is sustained and inspired by the determination of all the Allied nations to prosecute the war against Japan until she ceases to resist. The result of the futile and senseless German resistance to the might of the aroused free peoples of the world stands forth in awful clarity as an example to the people of Japan. The might that now converges on Japan is immeasurably greater than that which, when applied to the resisting Nazis, necessarily laid waste the lands, the industry, and the method of life of the whole German people. The full application of our military powers, backed by our resolve, will mean the inevitable and complete destruction of the Japanese armed forces, and just as inevitably the utter destruction of the Japanese homeland. The time has come for Japan to decide whether she will continue to be controlled by those self-willed militaristic advisers whose unintelligent calculations have brought the Empire of Japan to the threshold of annihilation, or whether she will follow the path of reason. After listing 7 terms under which the Allies would accept the Japanese capitulation, the declaration continued. We call upon the government of Japan to proclaim now the unconditional surrender of all Japanese armed forces, and to provide proper and adequate assurances of their good faith in such action. The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The decision rested with Japan. Would it be prompt and utter destruction, or surrender according to the plans outlined at Cairo and Potsdam, which accorded Japan an opportunity to refit herself for membership in a world of peaceful nations? In anticipation of Japan's possible surrender, it now became necessary to accelerate the preparation of plans for a peaceful entry into the enemy's homeland. The course of events had given the strategic control of the Pacific War to the United States, and as the conflict progressed, it became the nation chiefly responsible for the conduct of all operations dealing with Japan. Although the broad policies of occupation were agreed upon by the major Allied governments in accordance with the United Nations Charter, the United States would execute these policies, provide and regulate the main occupation forces, and designate their commander. Such control would also enable the institution of a strong centralized administration to avoid dividing Japan into national zones of independent responsibility, as had been done with Germany. In accordance with instructions from the Joint Chiefs of Staff received early in May 1945, General MacArthur had immediately directed his staff to prepare a plan for a possible peaceful occupation. The first edition of this plan, designated Blacklist, was published on July 16th and presented 4 days later at Guam, for comparison with a concurrent plan for occupation termed Campus, which was being formulated by Admiral Nimitz. General MacArthur's proposals were based on the assumption that it would be his responsibility to impose surrender terms upon all elements of the Japanese military forces within Japan, and that he also would be responsible for enforcing the final edition of Blacklist, called for the progressive and orderly occupation in strength of an estimated 14 major areas in Japan and from 3 to 6 areas in Korea, so that the Allies could exercise unhampered control over the various phases of administration. These operations would employ 22 divisions and 2 regimental combat teams, together with air and naval elements, and would utilize all United States forces immediately available in the Pacific. Additional forces from outside the theatre would be requisitioned if occupational duties in Formosa or China were required. The Blacklist Plan provided for the maximum use of existing Japanese political and administrative organizations, since these agencies exerted effective control over the population and could obviously be employed to good advantage by the Allies. If the functioning governmental machinery were to be completely swept away, the difficulties of orderly direction would be enormously multiplied, demanding the use of greater numbers of occupation forces. The preliminary opinions of the Joint Chiefs of Staff regarding the initial phase of the occupation inclined generally toward large-scale independent naval landings, as envisioned in the Pacific Fleet Headquarters Plan Campus. Campus, the naval counterpart of Blacklist, provided for entry into Japan by United States Army forces only after independently operating advanced naval units had made an emergency occupation of Tokyo Bay and seized possession of key positions on shore, including, if practicable, an operational airfield in the vicinity of each principal anchorage. General MacArthur felt that this concept was strategically unwise and dangerous, although he agreed that, immediately after capitulation, the United States fleet should move forward, seize control of Japan's homeland waters, take positions off critical localities, and begin mine-sweeping operations. The Japanese defensive positions were superior to any previously encountered by the Eighth Army in the Philippines, but they were frequently unoccupied. Many strong points had been abandoned by the Japanese, who had become jittery and thoroughly demoralized by the heavy air and naval bombardment. The initial objective, which included Wolf Airstrip, was secured before noon. The following day, San Roque Airfield and Zamboanga City were taken. The Japanese troops had withdrawn to the heights north of the city, and the only defense of the landing area came from sporadic mortar and artillery fire directed from well-constructed gun emplacements in the hills outside Zamboanga. The roads to and within the city, however, were heavily mined, planted with booby traps, and flanked by concrete pillboxes protected by wire entanglements. The beachhead was rapidly expanded along the east and west coasts of Zamboanga Peninsula, while to the north of the city, where the enemy had set up a strong defense area protecting artillery emplacements, progress was more difficult. Behind the enemy, on still higher ground, guerrillas had stretched a series of strong points across the peninsula, forming a barrier to their further retreat. The continuous pressure of the advancing 41st Division tightened the jaws of a vice which closed relentlessly on the Japanese forces. Only a small part of the enemy managed to escape through the guerrilla cordon. Grim and stubborn Japanese resistance slowed the advance into the mountains. However, with the arrival of the 186th Regimental Combat Team in the line late in March, the drive gained fresh vigour. By early April, organised resistance had ceased, and enemy opposition had degenerated into weak forays by scattered, uncoordinated elements that were later sealed off and decimated by a series of American landings along the western coast of the peninsula. Having established firm control over Zamboanga, the 41st Division could now begin the second phase of Operation Victor IV, the clearing of the Sulu archipelago to the south. The first action against the numerous islands comprising the archipelago took place on the 16th of March, when elements of the 162nd Regimental Combat Team landed unopposed near Lamitan on the northeast coast of Basilan Island. 2 days later, the same troops occupied Malamaui Island, northwest of Basilan. Thrusting deep into the Sulu archipelago, a battalion of the 163rd Regimental Combat Team on the 2nd of April bypassed Jolo Island, a major enemy stronghold, and landed unopposed on Sanga Sanga Island in the Tawi Tawi group. Objectives were quickly secured, and later the same day, a beachhead was established on nearby Bongao Island by the same battalion. Hostile action was limited to occasional sniper fire, and all organized Japanese resistance was broken by the 6th of April, when guerrillas were brought in to garrison Bongao. Guerrilla forces eliminated the few Japanese on WWII Island. With the fall of WWII, the Japanese lost their last opposition dominating their shipping routes to the oil-rich east coast of Borneo. General MacArthur emphasized the strategic significance of the seizure of this small group of islands in his communiqué of the 5th of April. The seizure of WWII secured the last link in the chain of blockading airfields, which the recapture of the Philippines had made possible. Along the entire coast from the northern end of Luzon to the southern tip of the Sulu archipelago, a distance of more than 1,000 miles, our airfields flank the waters of the South China Sea between the coast of Asia and the Philippines, while our fields stretching for 2,000 miles from New Guinea to the Philippines cover the waters necessary for communication from Japan to Java, Borneo, Celebes, the Moluccas, and all the other islands in the southwest Pacific. The width of the South China Sea averages only a few hundred miles, so that its expanse, as well as the coastline of the Asiatic mainland, is easily covered by our bombers in addition to our submarines. This cuts off enemy sea traffic to the conquered possessions to the south and severs the so-called Empire lifeline to the East Indies. The effectiveness of this blockade results from its great depth, permitting multiple airfields to bear upon the target. The enemy can easily slip through when covered only from one set of bases, but when he runs into successive belts flanked by fields extending for thousands of miles, he finds it impossible to pierce the blockade. The campaign of the southwest Pacific area along the coast of New Guinea through the Halmaheras and throughout the length of the Philippines had this end in view as one of its primary strategic objectives. Already our blockade has sunk many hundreds of thousands of tons of enemy shipping and, with the acquisition of the WWII base, is now in complete operation. For many weeks it has been difficult for Japan to ship oil, rubber, or other essential military commodities from the southwest Pacific to the homeland, or military supplies from Japan to garrisons in those waters. As the air pressure of our blockade reaches its peak, such traffic will become practically impossible. The entire Dutch East Indies are now isolated not only for exploitation, but from enemy reinforcement and supply. This is the culmination of one phase of the campaign that started from Milne Bay late in June 1943 and progressed through Kirivina, Salamaua, Finschhafen, Arawe, Gloucester, Sidor, Hollandia, Sami, Biak, Noemfur, Samar, Leyte, Mindoro, Luzon, Palawan, and Zamboanga, reaching its far end at WWII. Jolo, the central island of the Sulu archipelago, represented the only point remaining under Japanese control. American reconnaissance patrols had landed on the island on the 2nd of April, and the main landing followed 7 days later when the 163rd Regimental Combat Team attacked in force. Guided by advance scouts, the assault troops hit the beach unopposed about 5 miles from the town of Jolo. By the 10th of April, Jolo, together with Zettel Airfield, was seized without difficulty. The heaviest opposition was met at Mount Daho, a heavily fortified hill 5 miles southeast of the town, where approximately 400 Japanese had firmly entrenched themselves. This position required 4 days of shelling by artillery and 36 dive-bombing strikes before it could be reduced. By the 22nd of April, however, the back of Japanese resistance was broken. The enemy troops that managed to escape wandered in small groups throughout the island and soon fell easy prey to pursuing Moro guerrilla bands. Sibago, an inlet just north of Basilan, was taken on the 26th of April, and by the 10th of May, the Japanese forces on Jolo had been destroyed. After all major positions in the Sulu archipelago were secured, 7th Fleet motor torpedo boats, based on WWII, patrolled the entire length of the island chain. In addition, airstrips along the archipelago were repaired and enlarged for the use of Allied planes. On Zamboanga Peninsula, active patrolling continued until the 20th of June, when Victor W operation was officially declared closed. During the 2 months following the close of the operation, however, over 200 Japanese troops were killed, and more than 500 prisoners were captured. The Eighth Army next turned its attention to the reconquest of Panay, Negros, Cebu, and Bohol. These 4 islands constitute a strategic geographical unit commonly called the Southern Visayas. Within this smaller theatre, however, the topography required the division of operations into 2 areas, and consequently the plan for their liberation developed into 2 campaigns by separate task forces. The areas of these campaigns were separated by the steep mountain range that runs roughly along the north-south axis of Negros Island. To the west and northwest of this range lie Panay and Negros Occidental. To the east, Negros Oriental, Cebu, and Bohol. The mission of liberating Panay and Negros Occidental, Victor I operation, fell to the 40th Division with the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team attached. The capture of Negros Oriental, Cebu, and Bohol, Victor II operation, was assigned to the Americal Division. At the time these operations were launched in March and April 1945, the Southern Visayas as a group were isolated from the rest of the Philippine archipelago. American forces controlled most of the surrounding larger islands. To the north, Mindoro and the most important areas of Luzon were in American hands. To the south, the Zamboanga Peninsula and the Sulu archipelago had been invaded. To the west, Palawan had been captured, and to the east, Leyte and Samar were under the control of American forces. With all escape routes cut off by Allied naval and air superiority, the Japanese forces in the southern Visayas were caught in a trap from which there was no escape. Panay was the first of the southern Visayas to fall before the fast-moving onslaught of the Eighth Army. The 40th Division, less the 158th Regimental Combat Team, was withdrawn from operations on Luzon in the middle of March and placed under the control of the Eighth Army. This division, commanded by Major General Rap Brush, formed the nucleus of the assault task force, while the amphibious phase of the operation came under Rear ADM, Arthur D. Struble, commander of the Panay Attack Group. As in previous amphibious landings, the objective area was softened up by aerial bombardment before the invasion by ground forces. Starting on the 1st of March, nearly 3 weeks before the assault forces were to land, Marine and 13th Air Force fighters made almost daily aerial attacks on Panay, aiming at enemy installations and troop concentrations. Meanwhile, Allied naval forces harassed the enemy's overwater communications in Guimaras and Iloilo Straits. The task force departed from Luzon on the 15th of March and arrived off Panay 3 days later. After destroyer bombardment of the landing beaches, the assault waves landed near Tigbawan. As they waded ashore, the lead troops were greeted by men of Colonel Peralta's guerrilla forces. By evening of the first day, troops of the 185th Regimental Combat Team had advanced approximately 10 miles along the coast to Arevalo, in the direction of Iloilo. Only light opposition was encountered, most of the enemy having retreated north along the Sibalon River. By the evening of the second day, Mandurriao Airfield had been secured, and the 185th Regimental Combat Team stood poised for an attack on Iloilo, the largest city on Panay. The attack was launched on the morning of the 20th of March, and Iloilo was taken almost immediately. The Japanese garrison had beat a hasty retreat the previous night after destroying approximately 70% of the city. Before the landing, Colonel Peralta's guerrillas had virtually cleared the interior and coastal sectors of the island and had bottled up most of the Japanese garrison within the Iloilo area. As the fleeing enemy units hurried north from Iloilo to escape the American forces, they were met by guerrillas in defensive positions north of Jaro. The guerrilla strength was insufficient to stop the Japanese completely, however, and the enemy troops broke through the lines and continued their retreat. Pursued by American and Filipino forces, the Japanese were systematically ferreted out of their retreats and eliminated. Santa Barbara Airfield was secured, and by the 22nd of March, all organized enemy resistance on Panay had been crushed. Overwater and overland patrols by guerrillas, assisted by elements of the 40th Division, effectively reduced the isolated pockets along the north and west coasts. A small enemy garrison on Inampulugan Island was wiped out, while a landing party to nearby Guimaras Island found the Japanese had retired to the hills. The scattered enemy groups were gradually hunted down by guerrillas and American mop-up patrols. Meanwhile, the 40th Division prepared to move across Guimaras Strait to Negros Island. It was estimated that the relatively strong enemy garrison on Negros Occidental, consisting of the remnants of 2 divisions, would be able to prevent a rapid completion of the operation by the initial landing force of 2 regimental combat teams. Rather than withdraw units from other operations and cause a postponement of their scheduled dates of execution, however, it was decided to proceed according to the original plan. After the first landings, the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team would be made available to augment the forces of the 40th Division. On the 29th of March, the 40th Division, less 1 Regimental Combat Team, crossed Guimaras Strait from Iloilo and landed at Pulupandon on Negros Occidental. There was no preliminary naval bombardment, and the landing was made without opposition. The landing force pushed rapidly inland, and the strategic Bago River Bridge was secured after a brief skirmish. Lack of initial resistance was largely due to the assistance of the strong guerrilla units of Colonel Abseda, which were instrumental in confining the enemy principally to the north and northwest coasts of the island. Troops of the 185th Regimental Combat Team moved northward, crossed the Magsunge River in the face of intense enemy fire, and began their attack on Bacolod. After destroying a portion of the city, the Japanese garrison withdrew to the north and east, leaving a small delaying force capable of only limited action. Bacolod and its airdrome were secured by the 30th of March, and the outskirts of Talisay were reached the following day. By this time it had become apparent that the enemy did not intend to defend the coastal areas, but would make a strong stand in the rugged high ground of the north-central part of the island. The Japanese fought tenaciously at Talisay, but the town and airfield fell on the 2nd of April. Silay, a small barrio to the north, was taken the next day. Meanwhile, the 160th Regimental Combat Team had moved into positions at Bacolod, vacated by the 185th Regimental Combat Team in its drive northward. The primary objectives in Negros Occidental had been secured. The 40th Division controlled the most important section of the west coast, extending from Silay to Pulupandan, while the area south of Pulupandan was mostly in guerrilla hands. The division's next attack was directed inland against the Japanese prepared defences in the mountain ranges of north-central Negros. This eastward advance was rapid and opposed only by delaying actions of a minor nature. By the 4th of April, the only remaining enemy defence areas in Negros Oriental were the pockets in the central mountain range and the fortified town of Dumaguete. On the 8th of April, the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team made an overwater movement from Mindoro to assist the 40th Division. Taking charge of activity on the left flank, it began a concerted attack against the enemy's main defence line the next day. Japanese resistance to the 40th Division's advance increased with time, bearing out intelligence predictions that the thrust would encounter the enemy's main defences. Following the first day's operations in the division's assault, it became evident that progress would be slow and tedious, for the Japanese were well entrenched in rugged terrain. In spite of this vigorous opposition, the attacking forces advanced steadily as the Japanese fell back from strong point to strong point. During the latter part of April, the enemy defence deteriorated more quickly. However, it was not until mid-May that operations in the hills were considered to have passed into the mopping-up stage. Even then, with close support from bombers of the 13th Air Force and guerrilla reinforcements, the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team made but slow progress in the hill mass south of Fabrica. Isolated though they were, the Japanese in that area continued to resist until the cessation of hostilities on the 15th of August. Reconnaissance elements of the division, meanwhile, swung around the north coast of Negros and advanced down the east coast almost to Dumaguete. Here they were met by a combat team of the Americal Division, which had landed on the 26th of April as part of the Victor II operation. In this eastern area, no organised enemy resistance was found, and by the end of May, the pursuit of these fleeing remnants was taken over by Filipino guerrillas. In the mountains southwest of Dumaguete, United States forces encountered strong Japanese defences that were not overcome until the second week in June. On the 9th of June, the 503rd Parachute Regimental Combat Team received orders to relieve the troops engaged in Negros Oriental and garrison the island. It thereupon assumed the responsibility for all further operations on Negros. The veteran American Division, while still engaged on Leyte, was given the triple task of liberating Cebu, Negros Oriental, and Bohol. Pre-invasion plans called for an intense 5-day air bombardment of Japanese garrison installations and principal coast defences prior to the scheduled landing near the city of Cebu. Early on the 26th of March, following a devastating naval pounding, the American Division, less the 164th Regimental Combat Team, under Major General William H. Arnold, swept ashore near Talisay, 5 miles southwest of Cebu City. Although enemy reaction was limited to sporadic small arms and mortar fire, the assault waves ran into one of the most elaborate and effective beach defences yet encountered in the Philippines. The first troops to hit the beaches were halted abruptly by a system of buried landmines, which knocked out most of the landing craft. The 182nd Regimental Combat Team, which landed nearest Talisay, rapidly breached the mine and barrier defences. The 132nd Regimental Combat Team, however, was able to continue the advance inland, only after considerable delay in clearing paths through the minefields. The Japanese defensive installations were not confined to the beach area. However, it was found that the many well-prepared positions in Talisay had been abandoned as a result of the pre-landing barrage. In addition to planting numerous mines and booby traps, the enemy had constructed many pillboxes and barricades, commanding all road junctions and the main highway leading into Cebu City. These defensive installations were unmanned, however, and only intermittent sniper fire opposed the advance. With the assistance of guerrillas, Buhisan Reservoir was seized, and the city of Cebu was entered the day following the landing. After almost completely destroying the city, the main Japanese forces had withdrawn to positions in the hills overlooking Cebu and the Lahug airfield. Here the enemy concentrated his forces, pouring down heavy automatic fire from numerous pillboxes. Lahug airfield was attacked and quickly seized on the 28th of March, and nearby Mactan Island was taken without opposition the same day. Fanatical resistance was encountered, however, on the high ground above Lahug airfield. It became necessary to bring up tanks to support the infantrymen in the face of heavy automatic fire from mutually supporting caves and camouflaged pillboxes. These installations, together with demolition traps, formed an elaborate defence system that was overcome only with the greatest difficulty. Although the enemy was unable to launch a full-scale counter-offensive, he continually resorted to harassing tactics and local attacks. Infiltration parties frequently penetrated the American defences and, in one case, succeeded in destroying an ammunition dump. In view of the excellent key positions occupied by the Japanese on all principal terrain features, American Division forces at first were unable to dislodge them. The 164th Regimental Combat Team, less the 3rd Battalion, which was sent to Bohol, was committed on the 9th of April to bolster the units already employed. Converging in a wide envelopment from the south around the enemy's right flank, the fresh forces joined in a concerted attack on the 12th of April, which soon forced the Japanese to abandon their positions. The principal Japanese defences in the Cebu City area were overrun by the 20th of April, and the enemy withdrew northward, hoping to arrange for evacuation to Negros. With this action, the main fighting on Cebu was finished, and the bulk of the enemy forces throughout the Visayas had been overcome. General MacArthur's communiqué of the following day described the final fighting on Cebu and stressed the significance of the Visayan operations. On Cebu, our troops, in a wide enveloping movement, which caught the enemy unawares, attacked his positions from the west flank and rear and completely defeated him. His losses were very heavy, 5,000 dead being left on the field, with the remnants scattered into the hills to be hunted down by our guerrilla forces. This virtually concludes the Visayas campaign. Our forces now control the entire Visayan group, comprising an area of more than 33,000 square miles, and liberating a population of more than 6,400,000. In addition to the main islands of Leyte, Samar, Mindoro, Panay, Palawan, Cebu, Negros, Bohol, and Masbate, Japanese garrisons on a score of lesser islands, including Bantayan, Biliran, Burias, Guimaras, Homonhon, Lubang, Poro, Marinduque, Siquijor, Tablas, Tabao, and the Sibuyan group have been eliminated. This sweeps clear the centre of the Philippines and leaves the only remaining organised resistance in Mindanao on the south and Upper Luzon on the north. From the Visayas will come many of the foodstuffs and raw materials for rehabilitation and reconstruction of the Philippines and for prosecution of the war against Japan itself, including hemp, copra, metals, lumber, and cement. They already provide important air, land, and naval bases for attacks against vital areas in the Netherlands, East Indies, and southeastern Asia, and for our increasingly tight blockade of enemy shipping lanes down the coast of China, Indochina, Thailand, and Malaya. Our losses in this campaign were extraordinarily light, due largely to the enemy's continued inability to diagnose our point of attack and to understand our local tactics of combat. His ground forces throughout the Philippine campaign in numerical strength have equalled, and in some cases exceeded, our own. Yet he has seemed bewildered and confused, and although one of the most tenacious of fighters, he has permitted himself to be constantly surprised, divided, and destroyed in detail without being able to inflict more than a minor fraction of compensating losses. Mopping up operations on Cebu continued with movements up the coast as the American Division blocked Japanese attempts to reorganize or to evacuate the island. Control of the coastal areas forced the enemy to retreat to the hilly interior, where guerrillas and American combat patrols continued to hunt down and destroy scattered pockets of Japanese troops. By the 20th of June, the enemy on Cebu was no longer capable of offering effective resistance. Mopping up action continued well into August, however, as American Division troops which evoked no enemy naval or air reaction. Assault elements of the 19th Regimental Combat Team stormed ashore near Parang, only to find that the enemy had fled. They drove rapidly inland to secure Parang and the high ground overlooking Pollock Harbour. They then turned southeast along Highway No. 1 toward the vital junction where Highway No. 5 branches off in the direction of Cotabato and Sarangani Bay. Few enemy stragglers were encountered, and the advance was retarded only by the destroyed bridges along the road. By the next morning, the road junction had been secured, and the main force headed eastward toward Cabacan in the central part of the island. On the morning of the 18th of April, elements of the 21st Infantry set out from Parang in a shore-to-shore movement to the mouth of the Mindanao River with the mission of seizing Cotabato and Tamontaka. Their landings followed heavy air and naval bombardment and were unopposed. After the seizure of the town and the airfield at Cotabato, part of the same force proceeded up the Mindanao River. By this time, the initial mission of the 24th Division, the seizure of the Malabang-Parang-Cotabato area, had been completed 4 days ahead of the originally scheduled date. With the beach area secured, a two-pronged drive across the island to Davao Gulf was begun. A battalion of the 21st Regimental Combat Team started up the Mindanao and Pulangi rivers by gunboat and landing craft, while the 19th Regimental Combat Team began an overland movement along Highway No. 1. The objective was Cabacan, at the junction of the east-west Highway No. 1 and the north-south Saya Highway, Highway No. 3. Control of the Cabacan area would mean control of the island's road network. It would also prevent the Japanese from concentrating their forces and opposing the advance inland. In addition, it would isolate enemy pockets of resistance and establish a secure supply route into the central area. Finally, it would open the way to Digos and Davao Gulf. The 34th Regimental Combat Team, which had remained in floating reserve during the first 2 days following the landing, meanwhile disembarked and moved up to assist the 21st RCT. Since progress up the Mindanao River proved to be more rapid than along Highway No. 1, A battalion of the 34th RCT was assigned to capture Fort Pikit in a double drive, by land and by water, from the town of Paidu Pulangi, which had already been reached in the advance up the river. Aided by Navy gunboats, the river force landed safely near Fort Pikit, joining the rest of the battalion and moving into the old American fort by the afternoon of the 21st. The enemy had again retreated just ahead of the advancing Americans, and by the following day, elements of the 34th RCT secured the critical junction of Highway No. 1 and Saya Highway just south of Kabakan. The town of Kabakan itself was entered the next morning, after a brief clash with Japanese patrols. Control of this area placed the X-Corps in position to strike north along the Saya Highway to Malabalay and Makajalar Bay, and also southeast to Davao Gulf. By the same token, the main line of communications between the two principal Japanese defense sectors was severed. The 24th Division could now proceed down Highway No. 1 to seize Digos and split Mindanao in half. The 31st Division, which had arrived on Mindanao 5 days after the 24th Division, was available to proceed north up the Saya Highway to block the enemy's retreat from the east coast and secure the main north-south supply route. The final drive against the Japanese on Mindanao was thus divided into two separate and distinct actions along the two highways leading out of Kabakan. On the 24th of April, the 24th Division, which had advanced 60 miles in 7 days, launched its thrust along Highway No. 1 toward Davao Gulf. Although the retreating Japanese offered resistance in the form of light small arms fire, destroyed bridges, and mines emplaced along the route of approach, the advance was nowhere appreciably retarded. As the leading elements approached Digos, Japanese disorganization was reflected in the large quantities of abandoned equipment and supplies found along the way. The drive on Digos proceeded rapidly. On the 27th of April, advance elements of the division crossed the Digos River and entered the town. After a sharp fight, enemy positions were soon overrun. Davao Gulf was reached and Padada Airdrome secured on the 28th, making the drive to Davao Gulf one of the most rapid infantry advances of the Pacific War. Approximately 110 miles had been covered in slightly more than 10 days after the initial landing at Parang, and the front door to Davao was now open. While mopping up continued around Digos, the 24th Division turned north along Highway No. 1 toward Davao. Resistance was encountered from enemy positions en route, but the advance continued. After driving the Japanese from the high ground commanding the approaches to Davao, the city was entered on the 3rd of May. The next day, the mines and booby traps were cleared, and the remaining enemy troops were killed or captured. Seizure of Davao, the last major city held by the Japanese in the Philippines, came as a climax to a drive that had covered 145 miles in 15 days. Still remaining, however, was the task of finding and destroying the large enemy force that had withdrawn to the hills to the north and northwest. The 31st Division, commanded by Major General Clarence A. Martin, had meanwhile swung into high gear for its drive northward along the Saya Highway. Starting on the 27th of April, the division directed its initial thrust toward the town of Kibawe, at which point the Talomo Trail, running northwest over the mountains from Davao Gulf, joins the Saya Highway. Although slowed considerably by destroyed bridges, the division met only scattered delaying actions and was able to capture Kibawe and its airstrip by the 3rd of May. With this mission accomplished, the lines of retreat utilized by the enemy to evacuate his troops from the Davao Gulf area to central Mindanao were blocked, and his forces in the Davao sector were effectively isolated. The 31st Division continued to advance along the Saya Highway from Kibawe, concurrently with the 24th Division's drive on the defense above Davao. The enemy fought tenaciously to permit movement of his remaining combat units into the Malaybale area. By the 10th of May, however, elements of the division had reached Maramag, secured its airstrip, and continued the drive to the north. On the 15th, the Japanese made a desperate banzai attack in the vicinity of the airstrip, but it was successfully repulsed. This defeat ended the last major offensive action by the Japanese along the Saya Highway, and from then on, torrential rains became the main deterrent to the advance. Valencia fell on the 16th of May, and Malaybalay, the capital of Bukidnon province, was seized on the 21st. Late in April, it became apparent that the enemy was planning to consolidate for a final stand in the hills northwest of Davao. General Eichelberger therefore decided to land a regimental combat team at the rear of the enemy in the Macajala Bay area of northern Mindanao. This force would then drive down the Saya Highway to meet the 31st Division, advancing from the south. The 108th Regimental Combat Team of the 40th Division from Leyte was selected for the operation. It landed unopposed near Bugo on the 10th of May. The Japanese had withdrawn from the area, and the beach was already in the hands of guerrillas who had also captured the nearby town of Cagayan. The entire northeast coast was reported cleared of the enemy. The drive toward Del Monte Airdrome was only lightly opposed, and the airfield was secured on the 12th of May. The following day, stiffening opposition was encountered at the entrance to a canyon below Del Monte, where the enemy had set up strong, well-placed defences. Reduction of this strong point was completed by the 18th of May. However, the remaining Japanese troops were overcome within the next few days. The meeting between the 108th Regimental Combat Team and the 155th Regimental Combat Team of the 31st Division took place just outside Impalutao on the 23rd of May. The juncture of the two forces marked the end of Japanese resistance along the Saya Highway. With the Saya Highway opened and the Davao area liberated, the X-Corps campaign was strategically ended. The fighting, however, was not yet over. There remained the task of ousting the Japanese from the mountain areas to which they had fled. As usual, the enemy held fanatically to his hill positions, especially those east of the Saya Highway near Malaybalay. In that area, elements of both the 108th RCT and the 31st Division continued to send out strong patrols to the east and west throughout May and June. Late in June, a battalion of the 31st Division moved by water to the shores of Butuan Bay and advanced southward up the Agusan River toward Walo. The objective of this maneuver was to deny the valley to remnants of the Japanese forces east of the Saya Highway, and to destroy any of the enemy who might be moving south through the Agusan River Valley from the Surigao Peninsula to join the groups in that area. By the 1st of July, the battalion had reached Walo and had overcome all organized resistance. The remaining enemy groups fled to the hills. Operations against these pockets in the area between Malaybalay and Walo were still underway on the 15th of August, the date of the Japanese acceptance of the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. In the Davao area, the Japanese clung stubbornly to their positions near the western terminus of the Talomo Trail. The battle for the ground on the rank of the 24th Division's route to Davao raged throughout May and into June. Elements of the 41st Division moved from Zamboanga to enter the struggle, and on the 9th of June relieved battle-weary units of the 24th Division. Not until the middle of June, however, did the enemy's defences along the lower reaches of the Talomo Trail begin to disintegrate. From that time on, the fighting developed into the usual protracted mopping-up operations. The advance along the trail continued on to Kibangay, which was captured on the 26th of June. Beyond this point, the road became impassable and showed no signs of enemy fortifications. At the other end of the trail, elements of the 31st Division instituted a drive southeastward from Kibawe. Entrenched Japanese slowed the progress of the advancing forces, but by the 30th of May they secured a bridgehead across the Pulangi River. From there, the drive continued slowly to the village of Pinamola, which was taken on the 30th of June. During the ensuing weeks, the drives from both ends of the Talomo Trail encountered stubborn resistance, which continued until the end of hostilities. On the 30th of June, when the enemy had been driven out of both Kibangay and Pinamola on the Talomo Trail and had been forced to flee into the mountains east of Malaybalay, the Mindanao operation was officially declared closed. Action after that date was confined mainly to patrols, but an additional landing operation proved necessary to complete the destruction of enemy units on the island. Sarangani Bay in southern Mindanao, which had been considered in the early planning phase of the Philippine campaign as the initial landing spot for the return of General MacArthur to the Philippines, remained as the last point to be taken. Planning for the reduction of this area began early in July, with the 24th Division designated as the landing force. The scheme of manoeuvre called for a three-pronged offensive, two forces proceeding by overland routes, while a third made an amphibious landing on the north shore of Sarangani Bay. By this strategy, the enemy was to be hemmed in by concurrent offensives from the south, the northeast, and the northwest. An expeditionary battalion of Filipino troops was landed at Malalag Bay on July 7th and began its march overland toward Buayan the following morning. It encountered no organized resistance and arrived at Buayan on the 16th. The amphibious landing to the west of Buayan by a battalion combat team of the 24th Division was made on July 12th. Opposition was lacking since the area had already been secured by guerrilla forces. Meanwhile, a battalion of provisional anti-aircraft personnel serving as infantry had departed from Fort Piquet by landing craft to Lake Buluan and proceeded overland toward Tupi, where, on July 13th, it met advance elements of the battalion striking northwestward from its landing beach the previous day. Vigorous and extensive patrolling was carried out, but, except for occasional skirmishes, there was little resistance. The enemy retired northward into the mountains, where it required several weeks to rout him out of his positions. By August 11th, however, the mop-up of the Sarangani Bay area was considered terminated, and the operation declared at an end. With the completion of the Mindanao operation, the mission of the 8th Army in the southern Philippines was ended. General Eichelberger's forces, in a series of simultaneous and rapid offensives over a large area of diverse terrain conditions, had destroyed the enemy and left his decimated troops scattered in disorganized bands throughout the hills and jungles of the archipelago. All that remained was to accept the surrender of the helpless Japanese remnants. Now that the arduous task of the 8th Army in the Philippines was finished, a new job lay before it, a part in the occupation of the Japanese home islands. In a special communiqué to the press from his headquarters in Manila, General MacArthur announced the official end of the Philippine campaign in the following words: "The entire Philippine Islands are now liberated, and the Philippine campaign can be regarded as virtually closed. Some minor isolated actions of a guerrilla nature in the practically uninhabited mountain ranges may occasionally persist, but this great landmass of 115,600 square miles, with a population of 17 million, is now free of the invader. The enemy during the operations employed 23 divisions, all of which were practically annihilated. Our forces comprised 7 divisions. This was one of the rare instances when, in a long campaign, a ground force superior in numbers was entirely destroyed by a numerically inferior opponent. The Japanese ground forces comprised the following divisions or equivalents: 1st, 8th, 10th, 16th, 19th, 23rd, 26th, 30th, 100th, 102 days, 103 days, 105th, 2 days. Armoured, 2 days Airborne Brigade, reinforced to divisional strength. The 54th, 55th, 58th, 61st, and 68th. Independent Mixed Brigades, reinforced to divisional strength. 3 divisional units known as the Kobayashi, Suzuki, and Shimbu commands, organized from 28 independent battalions, 3 naval divisions comprising a provisional naval command of corps strength under Admirals Iwabuchi and Shiroya, and a large number of base and service elements. The total strength approximated 450,000 men. Naval and air forces shared equally with the ground troops in accomplishing the success of the campaign. Naval battles reduced the Japanese Navy to tactical impotence, and the air losses running into many thousands have seriously crippled their air potential. Working in complete unison, the 3 services inflicted the greatest disaster sustained by Japanese arms. The objectives of the campaign were as follows: 1. To penetrate and pierce the enemy's centre so as to divide him into north and south, his homeland to the north, and his captured Pacific possessions to the south. Each half could then be enveloped and attacked in turn. 2. The acquisition of a great land, sea and air base for future operations both to the north and to the south, comparable to the British Islands in its use as a base for Allied operations from the west against Germany. 3. The establishment of a great strangulating air and sea blockade between Japan and the conquered possessions in the Pacific to prevent raw materials from being sent to the north and supplies or reinforcements to the south. 4. The liberation of the Philippines with the consequent collapse of the enemy's imperial concept of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere and the reintroduction of democracy in the Far East. 5. The liberation of our captured officers and men and of internees held in the Philippines. 6. A crippling blow to the Japanese Army, Navy, and Air Force. In contrast to the New Guinea campaign, which had required 2 long years of uphill battle, the Philippine campaign had been won in 9 months of rapid operations. During this short period, American combined arms had routed the strong and hard-fighting Japanese 14th Area Army from its prepared defences and broken its power as a military force. The issue had been decided early in the campaign when the best of Japan's army, navy and air force had been crushed at Leyte. The invasion of Luzon a few months later climaxed the Philippine campaign and brought final and utter defeat to General Yamashita's divisions. The 8th Army's widespread series of operations covering the Visayas, Palawan, the Sulu Archipelago and Mindanao destroyed the remainder of Japan's once powerful 35th Army and completed the liberation of the Philippine archipelago. By the summer of 1945, every major island and every important strategic area was freed from the control of the enemy. General MacArthur had redeemed his promise, and the people of the United States their pledge to drive out the Japanese invader. The Philippines were again free. Victory in the Philippines had been achieved by the joint efforts of all forces involved. The intensity of the fighting varied from area to area according to terrain conditions and the state of the Japanese defences, but in all operations, the smooth coordination of United States land, sea and air forces had been the keynote of American success. The reaction of Japanese 14th Area Army staff officers to the part played by the component American forces was a tribute to this strategy of 3-dimensional warfare. Major General Haruo Konuma, Deputy Chief of Staff, 14th Area Army, commented on the combined use of the 3 branches of the United States forces in the following words. The U.S. Navy and American air power together made important contributions to American victory in the Philippines by their protection of landing convoys. Once ashore, moreover, the landing forces were given excellent protection by the supporting naval and air elements. The Air Force and the Navy contributed greatly to the success of the ground forces during and following the initial assaults, and then continued to keep open the routes to supply the land forces. The basic reason for American victory in the Philippines was America's ability to concentrate and maintain the necessary men and materials in the front line, while at the same time cutting the Japanese lines of communication. The well-coordinated action of their land, sea and air forces was also a substantial factor in achieving victory. Speaking of the U.S. Navy, Colonel Shujiro Kobayashi, tactical staff officer, said, "Through the action of submarines and carrier-based Grummons, Japanese supply was effectively cut off in the Philippines. The naval big guns also blasted beachheads before invasions, forcing our troops into the hills. Indeed, the American Navy seemed everywhere at once and powerful." Major Masaki Kawase, supply staff officer of the 14th Area Army, indicated how American air power had disrupted Japanese operations during the Philippine campaign when he stated, "I believe that American air power had a great deal to do with their victory in the Philippines, and it was the decisive factor in their success. The American pre-invasion air attacks on the Philippines had a marked effect in neutralizing our defense preparations. Damage caused by their frequent air attacks on airfield installations, aircraft, ships, etc., was tremendous. When our convoy ships were struck at Manila Bay, we lost 200,000 tons of war materials. At the time of the American invasion of Leyte, our Air Force was literally helpless and failed to conduct effective air operations against enemy convoy ships. Supremacy in the air and on the sea was quickly attained by the enemy in the Visayan area, thus making it impossible for us to reinforce and supply the 35th Army in Leyte at an opportune time to meet the invading forces. In Luzon, we had been always overwhelmed by the enemy air attacks, and our action was limited during the day. Above all, our supply lines were completely cut off, and with food and material shortages, we could not display but a fraction of the strength deployed on Luzon. A third staff officer of the Japanese 14th Area Army, Lieutenant Colonel Yorio Ishikawa, had the following comments to make regarding the American ground forces' conduct of the campaign. The United States forces, with their superior equipment and techniques, made surprise moves by overcoming terrain and inclement weather believed humanly impossible. For instance, the United States forces made landings on Leyte when a severe typhoon prevented our patrol planes from operating. In another instance, United States forces advanced through the difficult terrain near Baguio by constructing roads that we did not believe they could do. As far as the American ground forces were concerned, their performance during the Philippine campaign was in the highest tradition of the American Army. All soldiers engaged in the operations received praise from their leaders. General Eichelberger summed it up when he declared, "You boys have done a magnificent job. I am proud of every one of you." General MacArthur's remark that it was the finest hour for the Philippine soldier aptly describes the spirit that prevailed during the campaign. In the annals of American military history, the Philippine campaign would rank high as one of the great operations of the war. American forces had landed on Leyte on October 20th, 1944, and had continued their drive through Luzon and Mindanao, fighting on average at the rate of a battle a month until the last enemy-held territory was liberated on August 15th, 1945. In a space of time less than 1 year, the 8th Army had completed its mission in the Philippines and had freed millions from oppression and despair. The 17th and 18th Armies had been crushed. In the Philippines, the Japanese 14th Area and 35th Armies were being rapidly annihilated by the advancing forces of Generals Kruger and Eichelberger, who had begun to counterattack vigorously with encouraging results. In the Borneo-Celebes area, the Japanese 16th, 19th and 37th Armies were helplessly cut off and constituted no threat to General MacArthur's drive toward Japan. In the Pacific Ocean areas, the penetration of Japan's outer defense was completed with the seizure and occupation of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian in the Marianas. Operations had been launched in February to reduce the island of Iwo Jima and establish it as a base for fighter planes to support the Marianas-based B-29 bombers. With the capture of this important island in the Bonins a month later, the United States gained possession of a strategic military position only 750 miles from Tokyo, and pushed its forces far into Japan's inner line of island fortifications. They would be pushed even farther with the projected assaults on Okinawa and the Ryukyus, the next operations scheduled for the Pacific Ocean areas. From his strategic position in Manila, General MacArthur began planning for the final invasion of Japan itself, in accordance with the directives of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In the absence of any indications to the contrary, it appeared that the command structure which had existed throughout the war in the Pacific would continue unchanged. General MacArthur believed, however, that the Pacific Command required considerable revision if ultimate victory were not to be needlessly jeopardized. In December 1944, he expressed his views in a special radio to the War Department, stressing the necessity for reorganization. In his opinion, the command had to be greatly simplified, and the completely arbitrary area boundaries, which had originally been conceived for defensive purposes, had to be abolished altogether. As matters stood, the U.S. Army ground, air, and service forces were unevenly, and in some cases inequitably distributed between the Southwest Pacific area and the Pacific Ocean areas. Divided under two separate and independent commands, these forces could not be shifted with the speed and facility demanded by a rapidly changing battle situation, nor could they be employed with maximum efficiency. Until the campaign to liberate the Philippines, the individual operations in the Pacific had been conducted by relatively small forces, the size of a division or a corps. In the Philippines, however, an integrated army was employed on Leyte, and 2 armies were required on Luzon. The invasion of Japan proper would demand the use of an army group. General MacArthur proposed that a single commander should be responsible for the operational coordination of such large bodies of troops to permit their deployment to the best advantage. General MacArthur felt that the change in command structure should apply only to United States forces. In early January 1945, he recommended that Army and Navy Allied responsibilities continue as in the past, but that elements of the Australian fleet should come under the operational control of the US Navy. This would involve no difficulty since the respective elements of the 2 fleets had previously operated in close harmony. Australian ground and air units had been coordinated with the United States forces for nearly 3 years. Both from political and military points of view, General MacArthur declared, it is considered inadvisable to effect a reorganization. He felt that the guiding principle to be followed was to retain under a single command all army forces engaged in a campaign in a theatre against one enemy force. Any deviation from this, he maintained, merely weakens the potential, prolongs the war, and increases the cost in blood. He believed that the greatest efficiency could be secured by placing all naval forces under a naval commander and all army forces under an army commander, with the Joint Chiefs of Staff exercising overall direction and control. Only in this way could there be attained that complete flexibility and efficient employment of forces essential to victory. Unity of command for specific operations would be achieved by the creation of joint task forces. The task force commander in each instance would be chosen from the service having the paramount interest. General MacArthur also proposed that the same principle be applied to rear area troops and installations, with each service having its own supply and service organizations. In general, such a determination of command would place the great land masses, such as Hawaii, New Guinea, and the Philippines, under the Army, and the outlying posts, such as Guam, Kwajalein, and Manus Islands, under the Navy. This proposed organization, General MacArthur concluded, will give true unity of command in the Pacific, as it permits the employment of all available resources against the selected objective. The Directives of the 3rd of April 1945. On the 3rd of April 1945, the Joint Chiefs of Staff issued a directive which reorganized the command structure in the Pacific. Under this directive, General MacArthur was designated Commander-in-Chief, United States Army Forces in the Pacific, AFPAC, in addition to Commander-in-Chief, Southwest Pacific Area, and placed in administrative control of all Army resources in the Pacific, with the exception of the 20th Strategic Air Force, the Alaskan Command, and the Army forces in the Southeast Pacific area. All naval resources in the Pacific, except those in the Southeast Pacific area, were placed under the administrative control of Admiral Nimitz. This reorganization, in essence, meant that the Joint Chiefs of Staff would exercise strategic jurisdiction over the whole Pacific theater, assigning missions and fixing command responsibility for specific major campaigns. General MacArthur would normally be responsible for the conduct of all land operations, and Admiral Nimitz for sea operations. Each would have under his control the entire resources of his own services, and each was authorized to establish joint task forces or appoint commanders to coordinate the conduct of operations for which he had been made responsible. Thus, General MacArthur's proposal for 2 cooperating commanders-in-chief for the Pacific, one responsible for Army forces and one responsible for Navy forces, had in general been accepted. Actually, the 20th Air Force constituted a 3rd distinct command, since it would continue to bomb Japan in accordance with directives from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to General Henry H. Arnold, commander of all Army Air Forces. In a separate directive issued simultaneously with the reorganization order, General MacArthur was instructed specifically to complete the occupation of Luzon and conduct such additional operations in the Philippines as would directly contribute to the defeat of Japan and the liberation of the Filipinos, to make plans for occupying North Borneo using Australian combat and service troops, and to plan and prepare for the campaign against Japan proper, cooperating with Admiral Nimitz in the naval and amphibious phases of the invasion. With the issuance of the directives of the 3rd of April by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General MacArthur began a gradual regrouping of his forces in such a way that the necessary changes would be accomplished with a minimum disruption to operations already in progress. Effective the 6th of April, the War Department announced the establishment of the United States Army Forces in the Pacific, AFPAC, with General MacArthur as Commander-in-Chief. 11 days later, Lieutenant General Robert C. Richardson, Jr., commanding the United States Army Forces in the Pacific Ocean areas, was ordered to report his command to AFPAC for administration. Meanwhile, the 7th Fleet was transferred from General MacArthur's control to the administrative command of Admiral Nimitz. Representatives of General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz met at Guam early in April 1945 and agreed in general on the following principles to govern the reorganization of command in the Pacific. 1. General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz would immediately assume administrative command of their respective services. 2. Each would release operational control of all forces of the other service, except those fundamental to the functioning, development, or defense of their respective geographical areas, or to the success of previously scheduled operations. Resources to be released by each commander would include depots and supply systems of the other service. 3. Each commander would also assume as rapidly as possible full supply responsibility for the forces of his own service. 4. The existing Army and Navy responsibilities within the Pacific Ocean areas for the joint support of positions in the Marshalls, the Carolines, the Marianas, and the Ryukyus would continue in effect until modified by mutual agreement. 5. Both commanders would establish as quickly as possible their respective command organizations necessary for the planning and conduct of the phases pertaining to the invasion of Japan. The administrative reorganization was quickly completed. The transfer of operational control was the more important phase of the reorganization, but the Guam Agreement did not specify any definite schedule for the actual shifting of forces. Both Army and Navy resources in the Pacific were still split between the areas as both services went ahead with plans and staff studies for future operations. Army Air Force reorganization. During this same period, Army Air Forces in the Pacific were also regrouped for the final phase of the war. Before the 3rd of April, there were 3 Army Air Commands in the Pacific, each with a separate mission. The Far East Air Force, consisting of the 5th and 13th Air Forces, provided air support for operations in the Southwest Pacific area. The Air Service Command, together with units of the Army Air Forces, performed vital functions such as maintaining adequate bases, ensuring a continual flow of parts and supplies, and providing rapid maintenance service. The 20th Air Force was an independent Pacific command operating under the direct control of General Arnold. The super bombers of the 20th Air Force conducted long-range and photographic missions in strategic support of operations in the Southwest and Central Pacific areas. General MacArthur recommended to the War Department on the 14th of May 1945 that the Pacific Theatre be divided between the Far East Air Force, to include the 5th, 7th and 13th Air Forces, and the 20th Air Force, comprising the long-range bombers in the Marianas and the 7th Fighter Command on Iwo Jima. He also suggested that the Army Air Forces of the Pacific Ocean areas be abolished and their personnel transferred to the Far East and 20th Air Forces. On the 2nd of June, the Joint Chiefs of Staff announced a regrouping and reassignment of the various air forces in the Pacific. Headquarters of the 20th Air Force was scheduled to be transferred from Washington to Guam on the 1st of July, and simultaneously redesignated as the U.S. Army Strategic Air Force under General Carl Spaatz. The Texas Bomber Command, based in the Marianas, retained the title of the 20th Air Force and was placed under Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining. The XX Bomber Command, scheduled for deployment in the Ryukyus, was redesignated as the 8th Air Force under the command of Lieutenant General James H. Doolittle. Both the 8th and the newly regrouped 20th Air Forces were incorporated into the command of the Strategic Air Force, giving General Spaatz control of the mightiest fleet of super bombers ever assembled when he assumed command on the 16th of July. In July, the 7th Air Force, headquartered in the Ryukyus, was transferred to General Kenny's Far East Air Force. This completed the concentration of the Army's main air power in the Pacific under two major commands, the Far East Air Force and the Strategic Air Force. The 14th Air Force continued to operate in China as part of the Eastern Air Command under Lieutenant General George E. Stratemeyer. As plans for the invasion of Japan developed, General MacArthur made every effort to complete the liberation of the Philippines and rapidly carry out the projected assaults in the Netherlands East Indies. It was essential to free his command for the planned operations against Japan, as it was logical to assume that his well-organized veteran staff and forces would constitute the nucleus of the great land and air team assigned to defeat the Japanese in their home islands. General MacArthur viewed the liberation of key areas in the Netherlands East Indies as a United States obligation. In a radio to the War Department on the 28th of February, he outlined three main reasons for the necessity of a campaign in the Netherlands East Indies. First, he pointed out that the United States was obligated under the international agreement establishing the Southwest Pacific area to undertake such a campaign. To overlook the Netherlands East Indies after freeing US and Australian territories and restoring the former governments would represent a failure on the part of the United States to keep faith. Secondly, the re-establishment of the Netherlands East Indies government in Batavia would enhance the prestige of the United States in the Far East. With the occupation of Batavia, the Southwest Pacific area would accomplish its mission, except for necessary mop-up operations. General MacArthur felt that when the time came for such mopping up, the SWPA command should be dissolved, and responsibility for the conduct of civil affairs and further consolidation of territory should be turned over to the British and Dutch governments. Such measures would fulfill every obligation of the United States and, in addition, free General MacArthur from all future operational commitments outside the areas necessary for the actual launching of the assault on Japan.